Hello, namaste. Welcome to Dev's Hammer Show. This is English weekly talk show on Indigenous television and ITV Nepal. In this talk show, we feature in person or sometimes online interviews of guests from different diverse backgrounds. In this talk show, we discuss on issues impacting Indigenous peoples worldwide. We share the experiences and connect the communities. And today I have invited a very special guest who actually comes from an indigenous community, and he spent almost half of his life teaching journalism. So he has long experiences of teaching journalism in the renowned colleges in India, Asia College of Journalism, which is based in Chennai, and currently he is also undertaking a study on the status of indigenous journalists in the 7 Asian countries as well. So his name is Akash, and I actually have invited him while one of the conferences which is taking place in Kathmandu. So I have invited him at the studio, and let me first welcome him at the show. Welcome, Akash.
Thank you, Dev, for inviting me to the show.
And as I said in the background, I briefly introduced yourself. Could you just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah,
That
sure.
whatever I told perhaps is not adequate.
No.
Based on your experience.
It's fine. I'll just correct that I have not taught half my career, but I just taught for like 2 years, 3 semesters. So I primarily come from Gond tribe from central India. And I have studied sociology as my education, but I switched to journalism because I was fed up with, say, how indigenous people were represented in news media. So I would get Google alerts when I was in university, and every other news article was about violence, about discrimination, about all the negative things that you see in the community, right? So that really depressed me, that really made me very... Like, why is it? I see stories of resistance. I see our people fighting. I see our people celebrating. Why is it not here, right? So that's where my interest drew to indigenous media, and I feel that there is a lot of problem. There's a cultural sort of problem in the sense that in our communities, first of all, journalism is not something that people see as a professional because also it's a very risky kind of profession in our area. If you are working as a journalist in mining areas, militarized areas, you are automatically at risk.
But indigenous journalists are not only at risk in India alone, but also across the Asias,
across
Asia or across the world, right?
Across the world. I think the problem also is with journalism schools. So let me start there.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, I don't know about Nepal, but I don't know if Nepal's journalism schools have separate reservation or representation for indigenous students. Do they?
No, there is no reservation as such to get enrolled in the journalism. But there are certain faculties where there is a reservation as well.
Right.
But not in journalism.
Yeah. So same in India. I feel that most of the schools, they have either not at all tried to bring indigenous students. So even when I was teaching as a faculty in Asian College of Journalism, I was the only indigenous person as a faculty, and there was only one indigenous student in the entire batch. So it was very difficult to... Also, I think because journalism in India has become primarily English journalism, like it has a sort of a hierarchy where, English journalism is considered more important or more superior in something. So most of indigenous people don't get English education, right?
Mm-hmm.
They get educated in their vernacular or regional languages. So to become English journalist is very difficult. But you will find a lot of regional and vernacular journalists from indigenous communities.
In India, you talked about in India, the indigenous communities are not known as the indigenous peoples or Adivasis as well, but they are known as the scheduled tribes, right?
Scheduled tribes.
Could you just tell me about the indigenous peoples of India, such in detail? Let's say a kind of brief, how they are recognized, defined, and their status, perhaps.
I think it is very similar in other Asian countries. I think where indigenous people have officially not been given the status of indigenous people. And it has to do with the political scenario historically, how the Indian state sees the in the larger, say, scheme of things. They would say that everybody in India who is born is an indigenous person, so there is no separate indigenous identity that is given. But scheduled tribe is something that they call themselves Adivasi. Some of them now use the term indigenous people, and
Mostly
they are
from
claiming,
the central India.
yeah, mostly from central India. In the northeast, people prefer the term tribal, and I think it's merely a word, but I think the idea of indigeneity, that we are the first settlers of this land, is very much there. If we go into the nomenclature of what is indigenous, then it's a legal matter, right? It's a constitutional matter whether the state recognizes someone as not. But I think there is a very strong movement with land, related to mining, industrialization, militarization, all the issues that probably Asian or other countries, indigenous people are facing.
But in India, obviously the languages are a lot.
Yeah.
So in Nepal, even in Nepal, in a small country, what we call it, there are 142 different ethnic and caste groups,
Yeah.
speaking about 124.
Yeah.
But comparing with Nepal, India is much larger. There are a lot of languages, right? How many?
Yeah.
In fact, do you know about the
I'm
close
not
to
sure.
800, I guess?
Yeah,
More
but
than 800.
definitely 5 plus.
500 plus. But then, as you said, there is a problem that the medium of content of the media is not in indigenous languages.
It
Right?
is
Or-
actually
Mhm.
what I was saying, that the priority is given to English media, as in that is considered more authentic, more important. So just like your indigenous TV, there are many people who are running YouTube channels. I in fact wrote a piece a few years ago about, there was this one particular channel called Ho Samaj Media something, which belongs to the Ho tribe, and they have created this entire channel just to protect the language. So the entire channel is in Ho language. It produces news, events, and all these covers.
Who is Nagaland?
No, it's Odisha, Jharkhand, this area, central
okay.
eastern part. But similarly, there are other initiatives, like in my community, there is a TV called Koya TV. It's a YouTube channel. Initially, they wanted to start a TV channel, but they didn't have resources. So this guy said, "Okay, I'll start a YouTube channel." So language revitalization has become one of the primary kind of goal of indigenous media in India. As of that's how I see it. A lot of them are doing it.
And you yourself had started multimedia as such.
Yeah.
That is called as Adivasi
It was
Resurgence, right?
Adivasi Resurgence.
And could you just tell me about how that idea of starting
Yeah.
a multimedia actually was?
Yeah.
And what was the challenges that you had to close down that?
Yeah, definitely. So initially, I mean, I mentioned the motivation behind it was the misrepresentation. That also in India, it's very common for mainstream media to refer to indigenous people as primitive, as with all the stereotypes, as alcohol addicts or whatever, all those negative stereotypes. So I was not very happy with that, and I thought that there has to be an alternative platform. And since I knew a little bit of writing, editing, I thought I'll start it by myself. So I kind of started it as a personal blog. That was the idea. But then soon, some people joined in, volunteers mostly, and then it grew, and we were doing it self-funded. Yeah. So from 2015 to 2022-23, we had published around 60 tribal writers in English, which was a huge number considering that nobody has published so many tribal writers in English. So our main purpose was to translate what our people has already done into English to make it, reachable to the larger audience. Yeah, because there are a lot of indigenous media already there. They are doing it regional languages. Why don't we just translate it and, also produce new content in English? But I think financial and resource challenges, as very well, it has taken 10 years to build this solid indigenous TV, but 10 years is a long time, right? So I think that it was primarily because of the not being able to engage full time. I struggled, but I want to, and I'm working with some young people to sort of hoping that in future we can restart again.
So you said that, in India, actually, we have a culture. Nepal actually has a culture of again copying from the India. Even the media, all this initiative actually, even the indigenous language-based magazines or even Nepali magazines, which earlier initiated from India, right? So we have very much, a kind of culture of copying in India. But in India, as you said, why there are also many tribal groups or tribal groups or students going to the university as such. But why do you think the indigenous youth are not attracted that much in the journalism? Is it just because of there is not a quota in the journalism colleges, or also because of many other reasons?
I think it has to do with primarily, I mean, that's my understanding, is that there is a very structural bias against indigenous people in the mainstream society. And that bias works out in any field. So even it's not that, so we have government institutions in India where students, tribal students get enrolled to journalism. When they graduate, where do they go? They're not finding jobs. So it's not that our students are not studying journalism, but where is the place for them to work? Will they survive a media house where the payment is so low, plus hiring is very much network based, very much nepotistic and all those things, who knows who sort of a thing. So I think it's very difficult for indigenous people to survive the media environment. It's because there are many graduates. I can guarantee that there are probably thousands of graduates, right? But none of them you see, because they have either financially or they have just left because of risks. Yeah.
And in India there is very much controlled by the corporates.
Yeah.
But in Nepal we don't have that much kind of industries or corporates as such, but slowly getting controlled by the corporates. But India has a lot of corporate control rather than the government. Even now government control is there. What they call is now Modi journalism or Godi journalism. That's right.
So I think there is a problem with both a little bit, I would say. And I think that what you are doing, like a community based journalism, I see it as a very more long term ethical practice. Because with the corporate, the problem is that you're gonna be entangled in some unethical questions, especially if it is a, say, company like Tata or Vedanta who have a history of mining and violence, right? With the government, it's a right-wing party. So obviously, how would you work with a right-wing government party and talk about your issues? You cannot do that. So you have to figure out a system where you can self-sustain without being completely dependent on government or corporates. I'm not saying that it's not like we shouldn't be taking support, but it has. I think we are in a very tricky situation in this government and corporate in between. Yeah.
But I think this conversation actually, I think we can link with your own studies that you have been undertaking. The status of indigenous journalists in Asia, as you said. Perhaps in the course of a study you have interacted with journalists from different countries as well from the Asia. What is your observation? What other indigenous journalists actually shared with you? What are some of the challenges that they are facing when they are in journalism?
Okay, I think that from my perspective as someone coming from India, I firstly in when we had the IVAN conference in Chiang Mai.
The IVAN means Indigenous Voice Asia Network.
Asia Network.
So indigenous journalists in Asia have a network. Informal network.
So we had a meeting in Chiang Mai, right? And I think I felt that India is very far behind compared to all the countries that were visiting there. So in terms of whether it was Thailand or whether it was Malaysia or whether it was Nepal or it was Bangladesh, they had initiatives where they were very vocal, very resistant about it. But I felt, for example, there was a question which came up when I said that in India it's very common to call someone primitive in media, and then somebody from Malaysia pointed out, right? No, you can't do that. You can't do that. Sorry, Philippines. A group from Philippines pointed out, you can't do that. If you do that, they will get lashed back or something like that, right? But one of the problems that all of them are facing is resources, plus risks, right? Constant threat from the government or security agencies. It's almost common. So what I see is that what the problems that indigenous journalists in India have, more or less is same for every other indigenous community. It depends on the country's probably overall political system and something. For example, Thailand has a better ranking in the Press Freedom Index. Nepal has a better ranking, right? I think so. Nepal has a quite good ranking relatively, right? I don't know, I don't believe in all those rankings, but I still feel that, the issues are very common because it's all rooted to our indigenous people's struggle with for land and resources, right? Rights over land, resources, forests, and all these things. So I think that indigenous journalists in these countries are primarily, facing with resource crunch and, not being able to sustain themselves and, just doing work in smaller groups. But they are still striving, and I'm yet to learn more about it. So let's see once the report is out.
But again, as you said, one of the major problem that indigenous journalists are facing, as you outlined about the financial.
Yeah.
So that is, how do you think it is possible to address that one?
Yeah.
Right?
I am also not sure, because I think there has to be a way of an independent sort of ownership where nobody has a say on what we do or what we say. Yeah.
But again,
it's a difficult question. I don't have an answer to.
True that. Since I also have been following the international activism related with the media, and that we are at the good situation that we have international law that actually guarantees indigenous people's right to media. That is UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 16. So indigenous peoples, we actually have a right to establish our own media in our own languages. And same international law actually has put the obligation to the state parties to ensure that public as well as even a private media to make sure that indigenous peoples have access to the information in culturally appropriate manner and such. And nowhere again government has a duty to legally recognize indigenous media, but as you are conducting a study in 7 countries, I think there is a problem that the government is not recognizing legally, right?
Yeah. I think, again, adding to that, I think one of the recommendations that I also wanted to make was about the journalism schools. That in all these countries, one of the problems is that we should have more representation of indigenous people in media schools, in journalism schools. We should have indigenous faculties in journalism schools. How else will you change the way of teaching media? Right.
But your recommendation basically is to give a reservation on that, or a kind of quota, so that
or just demand these institutions that they should be accountable to this much percentage of their country.
But here, when we look, as I said earlier, we have a culture of copying many things from India. When India introduced this reservation quota or reservation policy in the government civil services, and there was also demand in Nepal. And Nepal actually introduced in 2007 this reservation, especially for not only for indigenous peoples but also for other marginalized communities too. And Nepal started, again, reversing this reservation quota, saying that in India it has already brought negative results, so that we revoke that decision on that. So what is your actually observation or your own experiences of? So do you support to the reservation or quota, or why?
I'm here because of affirmative action. Because if affirmative action wasn't there, my father wouldn't have been able to attain education, right? And if my father wouldn't have been able to attain education, I wouldn't have been able to get education. So I think that affirmative action has had, most of first, second generation indigenous people who are right now have greatly benefited from. I have studied I did my master's and MPhil in a central university, government university, where the fees was subsidized, plus we had reservation. So we have our, I think it has worked really well. And that's what I'm saying, that, we don't, I don't know how many countries are going to listen, but at least media institutions should be given at least one message that, there is some accountability, that how they report indigenous people affects indigenous people, and there needs to be a way to kind of fix it. Yeah.
So that means your point of view is, in order to report on the issues of indigenous peoples, there must be indigenous journalists in the desk.
Yeah, and editorial teams, right? I think decision making.
So what affects if there are not indigenous persons in editorial desk or the editing desk, if there are not indigenous journalists covering the indigenous issues? Does that give any negative connotation on that?
100%. I think when I was an editor with the magazine in Delhi, and I feel that at the time it was, for me, I had a lot of say, I had the option of commissioning stories. So I would be able to commission stories that I felt were more important in our communities, which other people just didn't know about. They had never even heard of them, right? So I came from a place, so I came with a certain perspective, and I think that perspective brought new stories to the magazine. Similarly, I think if a journalist is making a mistake, if I am an editor, I have a control over the whole process, right? But if I am simply a reporter, but my boss is a non-indigenous person who doesn't know anything about my community or my issue, it's going to be a problem. So we need people, indigenous people in leadership positions actually. We need reporters and journalists, but we need editors, right? I think that's very important.
But if you look into the status of ministry media, so-called ministry media or media as such, which is controlled by financially strong or the politically who are connected with, so that means there are hardly any indigenous journalists who are at the editorial desk, as you said. I think the situation is same in India and other part of the country as well. So how do you think, as being a scholar or a journalism faculty, this can be changed?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I think so. Oxfam India and News Laundry, one of the news media platforms, they did two reports. Who tells our stories? It was a study of all English Hindi media and other regional media and representation, and they found out that if I am remembering correctly, out of some 100 something institutions that they surveyed, there were zero tribal editorial representations, right? In most of the news media outlets, there was not a single tribal person. So it has to, and then you have had in the US, if I am not wrong, in the 70s, 80s, there is a resolution passed by news media, right? The American Editorial Association, if I am remembering correctly, they signed that an agreement that they will ensure by 2000 something that there are more people, there are more black people, people of color, and more diverse people are hired into. So whether it is New York Times or whether it is Washington Post or whatever it is, right? The similar thing never happened in India. And because all media houses are privately owned, so we don't have a control over them. So we have to kind of come and kind of question them, call them out, that how can you not have, if India's population is 10% tribal population, how can you not have out of 110 people in your office? Minimum you should have 5 people, but you have 0 people.
So that doesn't mean that even a private owned media doesn't have, I mean, it doesn't mean that they don't have a responsibility towards society.
No, not at all. They are not at all accountable.
But they have a responsibility.
Yeah, I think we have to make them responsible, I feel, because journalism, I mean, media institution has a social responsibility, right?
Social responsibility and voices.
Yeah.
I mean, the media is, of course, it is said that mirror of the society, right?
Yeah.
But when you look into the privately owned media, you cannot see the mirror reflection of the society in the media or coverage.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So that is because that there are not the marginalized communities who are not working in the media.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think that the more stories that we tell, it changes the negative perspectives, right? Because we are bringing our own. And I think indigenous journalism, I also see there's a connection between journalism and kind of academia, where say in sociology or anthropology, what a researcher does is they do a very long-term deep engagement with the field. The same thing a journalist does. Indigenous journalist does far ahead because they are very much involved with the community, right? So I see that, I mean, I think that there is a lot of scope for indigenous journalists to, to do better, Yeah.
So even if you look into, take example, many, funders, they also don't fund directly or, giving more priority to the, any fund reaching to the indigenous journalist or indigenous media as such. there is. Do you think there is also a kind of biasness?
Can I ask you why,
Yeah.
in your understanding, why don't they do that?
I have no question. I mean, no answer on that one. But
Yeah.
what is your observations, being a researcher or faculty member? Why do you think this international funders, as you talked about the Oxfam International or so many other organizations, they do research.
Yeah.
There is a problem,
Yeah.
but
Why don't they?
but they don't address in the situations
Yeah.
or just affirmative actions or giving
Yeah.
more priorities to the indigenous journalist or tribal journalist or minority journalist.
Yeah.
Why don't they give or invest there?
So I feel that there is a corporate interest there. For instance, in my state, the steel companies are building army camps. Now, why would a corporate say? And I feel that a lot of international donors have links with mining companies, as far as I understand, because mining is one of the biggest industries of like the global economy, right? Mining. So I feel that somewhere where there is a conflict of interest, they might not be interested. I feel that if someone is overly exposing Adani, for example, who is causing havoc in Australia or in central India, in my district, for example, right? So a company, why would they invest if they have,
True.
a funding agency which has close ties with CSR of Adani? So I think I don't know how to address this, but I feel that with the corporates' money, or it's we have also become a little, because they are already doing, corporates are already funding pockets of people for propaganda. So they can also fund indigenous media. They can call it indigenous media,
But
but
which works
against our
in
people.
their favor.
Against their favor, right?
Okay.
So yeah, it's a complex thing. I think we'll have to have a long conversation. Yeah.
Too. So Akash, we have almost at the end of the show.
Yeah.
So I would like to give you an opportunity, perhaps, to give one-line message.
Oh.
Message to the perhaps the universities or the colleges which
Yeah.
are running journalism.
Yeah.
And in order to attract more and more
Yeah.
indigenous journalists to the journalism field,
Yeah.
your message, a kind of message, what we should do or message
Yeah.
to them.
Okay, I don't have a message per se, but I think that institutions and universities, they should acknowledge that people from different diverse backgrounds bring a lot with them, and not just their lived experiences. Their lived experiences are guiding how they think, how they write, how they present themselves and everything. And I feel that indigenous students have, say, very new and different interesting stories to tell. So I feel that journalism would be actually enriched by indigenous students if journalism schools had more indigenous people. Plus I think that as long as media wants to address this negative stereotypes, they will have to bring indigenous journalists.
So thank you so much, Akash, for
Thank you, Dev.
joining us in my show.
Yeah, thank you, Dev. Thank you so much.
We have reached at the end of the show, but our conversation continues. If you have any queries or feedbacks, you can reach us at indigenous.television@gmail.com. Next week, I will come up with a new guest to discuss a new topic. So I would like to request you join next week. By then, have a nice weekend. Bye-bye. Namaste.